step into a world of imagination where science meets mystery. On this channel, Sci-Fi Stories, you'll experience exciting sci-fi stories about futuristic worlds, space adventures, advanced technology, and unexpected twists. Every story is told in a natural human voice, not AI generated, to give you a more real and engaging storytelling experience. If you love immersive sci-fi tales and powerful storytelling, you're in the right place. Let's start the story.
They gave her the worst ship in the fleet, the oldest crew, the mission nobody wanted. They did it because they thought she'd fail quietly, far from anywhere that mattered. They were wrong about the failing. They were catastrophically wrong about the quiet. The Veilhari had a word for humans. Muvek. It didn't translate cleanly. Nothing in their tongue ever did. But the closest approximation in galactic standard was something between soft-boned and briefly interesting. The way you might describe a moth that had flown into your observation deck and was currently walking in small confused circles near the viewport. Fascinating for approximately 40 seconds. Gone before you finished your tea. They weren't cruel about it. That was the thing humans kept misunderstanding when first contact transcripts got declassified and people back on Earth read them and got their feelings hurt. The Veilhari weren't dismissive from malice. They were dismissive from data. They had been spacefaring for 11,000 years. They had catalogued 412 sentient species across 6 galactic arms. They had watched civilizations ignite and collapse, and ignite again, like brush fire across a dry continent. They had developed, over those 11 millennia, a very precise taxonomy for where a species sat in the grand architecture of things. Humans sat near the bottom of that taxonomy. Not the very bottom. The Grethi, bless them, had achieved faster-than-light travel and then immediately used it to attempt to deliver fruit to a neighboring system, gotten lost, and gone extinct. But close. Humans were catalogued under the subcategory the Veilhari called Vetala Mur, which meant, roughly, species in the process of almost becoming something. Potential without proof. A sketch that hadn't been painted yet. You noted them. You were mildly curious about them. You did not, under any circumstances, assign them a seat at the conclave. That last part was the part that stuck in Commander Dara Vasquez's throat like a bone. She was reading the transcript again. She knew she shouldn't. Her therapist, back when she'd had time for a therapist, had specifically said, "Stop reading the transcripts, Dara. You're not helping yourself." But the forward observation deck of the Unbroken March was empty at this hour, and the stars outside were doing that thing they did out past the Karath boundary, where they seemed slightly too close, slightly too sharp, like they'd been cut by someone who had a grudge against subtlety. She had a cold cup of coffee in one hand and the transcript in her datapad, and 6 months of being the only human commander in a Veilhari-led coalition fleet sitting in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed and couldn't quite digest. Assessment of Human Combat Capability, Coalition Intelligence Division, Stardate 7.441.9. Human vessels are structurally adequate. Human navigators demonstrate competence within established parameters. Human ground forces exhibit acceptable endurance metrics. However, several behavioral anomalies continue to complicate integration. Human officers demonstrate a persistent inability to disengage from tactical situations that have been formally assessed as unwinnable. This is not classified as courage by the division. Courage implies a rational calculation of acceptable risk. Human behavior in these situations more closely resembles a computational error, an inability to process the abort variable. Additionally, human emotional response to crew casualties appears disproportionate and interferes with command efficiency. The division continues to recommend that human units be assigned support roles only. She set the datapad face down on her knee. Support roles only. She knew the ship they'd given her was a message written in metal. The Unbroken March was a Veilhari 7th class support carrier. which was the Coalition's polite way of saying it was the thing that showed up after the actual fighting was done and kept the lights on and moved supplies from one place to another and basically functioned as the galactic equivalent of a very expensive grocery delivery service. It was old. It had a name that was embarrassing in context. Someone in the Human Integration Office had picked it, probably thinking it sounded defiant and inspiring, not realizing that the Vailhari word for march had a secondary connotation of futile forward movement toward an obvious obstacle, which meant that every Vailhari officer in the fleet had spent 6 months subtly smiling when they addressed her ship by name. She'd figured that out 3 weeks in. She'd told no one. Her crew knew, though. Her crew, her impossible, exhausting, wonderful crew of 83 humans and 4 alien enlisted personnel who had drawn the short straw of assignment, knew everything. They had the specific social intelligence of people who had spent their entire lives in rooms where they were the ones being assessed, evaluated, smiled at politely. You developed a radar for it. You got very good at reading the smile. "Commander." She didn't turn. She knew the footfall. Lieutenant Priya Nair moved like she apologized for taking up space, which was the most deceptive thing about her. She was the March's navigator and the best spatial tactician Dara had ever worked with, which was saying something, because Dara had spent 3 years at the Kepler Academy surrounded by people who could calculate jump trajectories in their heads while someone was yelling at them. "So you're doing the transcript thing again," Priya said. "I'm not doing anything. I'm enjoying the stars. Your coffee is cold. I enjoy cold coffee." Priya sat down beside her on the observation bench without being invited, which was either insubordination or familiarity, and at this point in their service together, Dara had stopped distinguishing between the two. She had a data pad of her own, and she set it on the bench between them, and Dara looked at it despite herself. Fleet deployment orders, new routing assignments from Coalition Command. Her eyes went to the coordinates first, then to the mission classification, then back to the coordinates. She picked up the data pad. She read it twice. When did this come in? 40 minutes ago. I wanted to verify the coordinates before I brought it to you because I thought maybe Command had made a clerical error. Priya's voice was perfectly level. They did not make a clerical error. Recavar Station. Dara knew the name the way she knew the names of bad dreams. Not because she thought about it often, but because when it surfaced, it came with a specific cold weight. Recavar was a Vailhari deep space resupply station, the furthest Coalition outpost in the 6th Arm, sitting at the intersection of 3 navigational corridors that, if you controlled them, let you move a fleet anywhere in the outer systems without anyone knowing about it until you were already there. The Keth had been trying to take it for 4 years. The Keth were not like the Vailhari. The Vailhari, for all their 11,000-year condescension, were fundamentally a civilization that had decided expansion was better managed through bureaucracy than bloodshed. They acquired things slowly, carefully, through treaties and trade agreements and the extremely effective strategy of simply outlasting everyone who disagreed with them. The Keth had looked at that approach and decided it was for people who lacked ambition. The Keth expanded the way a fire expanded, constantly, indiscriminately, and with profound indifference to what had been there before. Recavar Station was currently under siege. Recavar Station had been under siege for 11 days. The primary battle group, Priya said, pulled back to regroup after the Keth's second assault wave. Is standard protocol. The Vailhari tactical model calls for withdrawal and consolidation when facing a force with numerical superiority. I know the model. The station has 1,600 personnel on it. About 400 of them are non-combatants. Medical, research, civilian contractors. Priya paused. About 90 of them are human. There it was. 90 of them were human, and Coalition Command had sent the support carrier, the grocery delivery service, the ship whose name was, in the secondary Vailhari connotation, a joke about futility. Dara put the datapad down and looked at the stars. They were still too sharp, too close. What's the transit time? she said. 14 hours at standard jump. 11 if I push the nav drive to 110%, which technically violates the service warranty, but the warranty is administered by a Vailhari contractor in the 9th Administrative District who has never met me personally, and so I feel comfortable with the violation. And the Vailhari Primary Battle Group? 31 hours for reconsolidation, minimum. 20 hours. 20 hours where Recavar Station sat with 1,600 people on it and nothing between them and the Keth but whatever internal defences they had left. Dara picked up her cold coffee, drank it, made a face. Not because it was cold, she genuinely didn't mind cold coffee, but because she was buying herself 4 seconds to think, and the face gave Priya something to look at that wasn't her eyes. "Wake the department heads," she said. "Full briefing in 20 minutes. Priya stood up. She was almost at the door before she stopped and turned back and said, with the very specific, careful tone she used when she was choosing to say something she wasn't sure she should. "Command didn't order us there, Commander. The orders are to hold current position and await the battle group's reconsolidation." "I know. If we go without authorization..." "I know, Priya." A beat. 2, 11 hours, Dara said. Priya's mouth did something that was technically not a smile and technically not a smile. 11 hours. Possibly 10:45 if I'm feeling creative. Go wake the department heads. She went. Dara sat alone with the stars for another 30 seconds. She thought about the report she'd read, an inability to process the abort variable. She thought about the 90 humans on Recavar Station who were currently doing the math on 1,600 people versus a Keth siege fleet and coming up with a number she didn't want to think about. She thought about the Unbroken March and its embarrassing name, and its old hull, and its crew of 83 people who had, all, in their various ways, been told they were support roles only. She set down the coffee cup. She went to brief her department heads. The briefing room was small enough that it smelled like everyone in it, which was a design failure that Dara had noted in 3 separate maintenance reports and which had been addressed in 3 separate maintenance responses with the Vailhari equivalent of noted low priority. The table could seat 12. They had 9 people around it, which meant there was technically enough room, but not enough room to pretend they weren't all crammed together. And in Dara's experience, cramped rooms either made people feel like a team or made them want to murder each other. And with this crew, it had gone the former direction, which was one of the only advantages of flying a ship that even the maintenance division had ranked low priority. Chief Engineer Thomas Okafor was the first one in, because he was always the first one in, because he had the energy of a man who had been running towards something since birth and hadn't decided yet what it was. He was 42 and built like a person who spent most of their time in engineering bays that weren't quite tall enough, slightly hunched at the shoulder in a way that wasn't injury but habit. And he looked at the deployment coordinates on the briefing screen and said, "Oh, hell yes," with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of problem. Dara loved him for that. Medical Officer Dr. Sable Wren came in next and sat down and read the screen and said nothing for a long moment and then said, "How many civilians?" in the voice she used when she was computing things Dara didn't want computed. "About 400. We think. Communication blackout from the station went up 6 days ago. We're working with pre-blackout manifests." Sable wrote something on her notepad. Dara didn't ask what. The rest filed in over the next 3 minutes. Tactical Officer Jinho Seo, who was 26 and had the focused stillness of someone who had grown up very poor and learned early that stillness was cheaper than restlessness. Communications Specialist Rada Okonkwo, who was the reason the March could actually talk to Vailhari ships in real time instead of the 30-second translation delay the standard systems ran. Weapons Officer Lena Marsh, who Dara had requested specifically because the Coalition had done everything it could to give the March minimum viable armaments, and Lena had a gift for making minimum viable armaments behave like something considerably more, and the 4 alien crew members, Ensign Threth, A young Veilhari who had been assigned to the march as part of the integration program and who had spent 6 months oscillating between genuine curiosity about humans and the deep structural discomfort of someone whose entire civilization had just been told their data might be wrong. And 3 Polari enlisted crew whose names translated poorly into human phonics and who had given themselves nicknames in the first week, Rook, Sparrow, and the one everyone just called 8 because she had 8 fingers and had shrugged and said it was easier. Dara stood at the head of the table. She told them where they were going. She told them why. She told them what command had ordered. She did not tell them what to do. That was not how she ran a briefing. The room was quiet for a moment that had some weight to it. Tomas said, "What's the hull condition on the station's defense grid? Do we have any specs from before the blackout?" That was a yes. Jinho pulled up the Keith Siege Fleet's last known configuration on his datapad and started talking about intercept vectors, and it had the texture of, "What do we have to work with?" rather than, "Should we go?" And that was also a yes. Sable said, "I need to know if they have a functioning medical bay or if I'm walking in to set one up from scratch." And she was already pulling up supply manifests, and that was a yes. Only Ensign Threth said nothing. He was sitting very still in the way Veilhari sat still when they were doing the internal computation their physiology required before speech, and Dara watched him out of the corner of her eye without appearing to watch him. Finally he said, "In carefully precise galactic standard, Commander, the Veilhari tactical assessment of this situation is that Recavar cannot be held with a single support carrier against a Keth siege fleet. The mathematics do not—" "I know what the mathematics say, Ensign." "Then I am not certain I understand the plan." Dara looked at him. He was young. He had very good data. He had been raised in a civilization that trusted the data. "The plan," she said, "is to go. The rest we figure out when we get there." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had just been handed an instruction manual written in a language they didn't speak. And then he looked around the table at the other humans who were nodding, and she could see him computing the anomaly, filing it under behavioral irregularity, human ref. Intelligence Division Report 7.441.9. And coming to terms with the fact that he was going to Recavar Station on a ship whose name meant futile forward movement. "Understood," he said finally, in the tone of someone who did not fully understand but had decided to follow anyway. Dara nodded. "Good. Tomas, what do you need to push the drive to 110? 12 minutes and someone to hold my coffee. You don't drink coffee? I'm thinking about starting." The room moved. People stood and sorted themselves into tasks the way people did when the decision had been made, and all that was left was the work. Dara stayed at the table for a moment after they'd gone, looking at the deployment coordinates still glowing on the briefing screen. Recavar. 11 hours, 1,600 people. She thought about the Veilhari Intelligence Division and their precise taxonomy of species. She thought about Vithala Muir. Potential without proof. She picked up her cold coffee from where she'd carried it in, drank the last of it, and went to go prove something. The unbroken march dropped out of jump at the edge of the Recavar system, and for exactly 4 seconds, everyone on the bridge was completely silent. Then Rada said, "Well." Then Lena said, "Okay." Then Tomas, over the intercom from engineering, said something in Portuguese that didn't need translating. The Keth siege fleet occupied the space between the jump point and Recavar Station like a city that had decided to float. 47 vessels on initial scan. Maybe more on the far side of the station where the March's sensors couldn't fully reach through the interference of the station's own damaged systems. The Keth didn't build ships the way anyone else built ships. They grew them, in the biological sense, enormous organic hulls that were part vessel and part living organism. Dark-surfaced and asymmetrical in ways that made them look, from a distance, like the debris of something much larger that had exploded and refused to acknowledge the explosion. They were beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful, when they are also terrifying. 47 of them, minimum. One of the March. Dara stood at the command console and looked at the tactical display and let herself have 3 full seconds of pure, clear-headed "what did I do?" 3 seconds. Then she put it down. "Rada, open a channel to Recavar." "Trying. Station comm is damaged. I'm getting a carrier signal, but it's fragmented. Give me a minute." "Jinho, threat assessment." Jinho was already at it. His fingers moved over his console with the precise economy of someone who had rehearsed this scenario in his head 100 times on the long jump over, which he had because Dara had asked him to and because he was Jinho, and he would have done it anyway. The siege formation is standard Keth encirclement. They've got the station's primary approach vectors locked down. 3 destroyer-class vessels are running close orbit interdiction, which means the station's external docking is compromised. They're not trying to destroy the station. They're trying to starve it. He paused. "Commander, the station's defense grid, looking at what's still active, it's running at about 30% capacity. Someone inside has been doing some very creative jury rigging to keep even that much online." 30% of what? 30% of a grid that was already undersized for a siege scenario. So, he did the math visibly, the way he did when the math was bad, and he wanted her to see him doing it rather than just delivering the number. "Not great. What about the Keth? Are they actively assaulting?" "Negative. They went quiet about 18 hours ago. They're holding position." He frowned at something on his screen. "That's interesting, actually. They've been in position long enough that they could have finished this. Why are they waiting?" Dara thought about that. The Keth didn't wait. And that was the defining military characteristic that every coalition briefing hammered on. The Keth prosecuted campaigns with the relentlessness of geological processes. They didn't regroup. They didn't negotiate. They pushed until the thing they were pushing against broke, and then they pushed through the pieces. Why were they waiting? "Rada." "Almost. Got it. It's rough, but it's live." She looked up from her console with an expression Dara couldn't immediately read. "Commander, the station master is asking to speak with you personally." "Put them through." The voice that came over the channel was not what she expected. She had expected, given everything, the siege, the blackout, the 11 days, something ragged, something at the edge. The voice that came through, under the static and the signal damage, there was steady in the specific way of someone who had made their peace with the situation and was now simply operating inside it. "This is Station Master Kale Voss, Recavar Station. Identify yourself." "Commander Dara Vasquez, CNS Unbroken March, Human Contingent, Vilhari Coalition." "Station Master, what's your current status?" A pause. Short, but there. "Unbroken March. You're a support carrier." "Yes." "Commander Vasquez." Another pause. Longer. Is there a battle group behind you?" "Are you the advanced scout?" Dara had thought about how to answer this question for approximately 9 of the 11 hours it had taken to get here. She had not come up with a satisfying answer. "Negative, Station Master. We are the current response. And the battle group is 31 hours out at minimum." The silence that followed was the kind that had shape to it. She could feel Priya at the navigation console go very still. Ensign Threth, at the secondary communications board, looked at his hands. "I see," said Station Master Voss, in a voice that meant he did not see at all that he was in fact standing in the rubble of a calculation he had been holding together for 11 days, and the rubble was quiet. "Commander, I have 1,142 people still alive on this station. I have approximately 4 days of life support reserves. I have a defense grid that Ensign Chidi has been running on creativity and profanity since day 3, and Ensign Chidi is... He's very tired. We have been holding." He stopped. "We have been holding." "I know you have. The Keth stopped their last assault 18 hours ago, and we don't know why, and that scares me more than the assaults did." "I know. What I'm asking you, Commander, what I need to understand, is whether there is a plan or whether you've come here to die with us, because I respect the second option, I do, but I have 1,100 people, and I'd like to know which thing I'm looking at. Dara looked at the tactical display. 47 Keth vessels, 1 support carrier, 31 hours until the battle group, 4 days of life support. Station Master, she said, I need you to get me Ensign Cheedy. A pause. He's running the defense grid. I know. That's why I need him. Ensign Benedict Cheedy sounded exactly like someone who had been running a jury-rigged defense grid on creativity and profanity for 11 days. He had the voice of a person who had gone past exhausted into some territory that didn't have a name yet, where the body keeps running on something that isn't quite energy and isn't quite will, but is some desperate alloy of both. He also, within about 45 seconds, revealed himself to be one of the most technically brilliant engineers Dara had ever spoken to. Okay, so what I've got, he said, with the rushing cadence of someone offloading information they'd been holding alone for too long, is the primary emitter array running through a bypass I built from 2 Vialhari comm relays and a piece of the secondary food processing unit, because the actual coupling burned out on day 4, and the replacement parts are in a storage bay that is currently on the side of the station facing the Keth. And I'm not going over there, it's fine, this works, mostly. Benedict. Dara used his first name deliberately. His cadence paused. I hear you. Write down what you've got. All of it. I'm going to put our chief engineer on with you in 5 minutes, and I need you to tell him everything. Your chief engineer? Tomas Okafor. He's very good and he's extremely hard to shock, which I think is going to matter. A sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something that had stopped short of becoming a sob. Okay. Yeah. Okay. You've been doing extraordinary work. Silence. Then, quieter. I couldn't let them in. I kept thinking about the civilians and I couldn't let them in. I know. She transferred the channel to engineering and turned back to the bridge. Okay, she said. Jin Ho, talk to me about the Keth waiting. He had been thinking about it. She could tell. He had the particular stillness of someone who had been working a problem in a small, focused corner of his brain while the rest of him did other things. And now the problem had yielded something. There's a pattern in the Keith assault history I've been looking at. Every time they've held position like this, I found 4 other documented cases. They stopped because they were waiting for a specific asset, a command vessel. A Keth command structure is distributed, but there's a ceremonial hierarchy around major acquisitions. A station this strategically significant, they'd want the fleet's lead matriarch present for the formal claiming. Dara went still. You're saying they're waiting for a VIP. I'm saying the most probable explanation for why a Keth siege fleet with overwhelming numerical superiority has not yet finished taking a station it could have finished taking 6 hours ago is that they're waiting for someone to arrive so that someone gets to be present at the moment of taking. He paused. It's cultural. It's important to them. Which means we have a window, Dara said. That closes when that command vessel gets here. How long? Priya asked. I don't know. Could be hours. Could be less. The bridge was quiet for a beat. Dara looked at the tactical display. 47 ships in encirclement formation, holding, waiting for their matriarch. A station with 30% defense capacity and a genius ensign running it on prayer and spare parts. 31 hours until backup. She started doing the math. Not the math the Vialhari Intelligence Division would have done. The clean math, the probability math, the math that told you when a variable said abort. The other math, the stubborn, granular human math that started with what do we have and worked forward from there. Tomas, she said into the intercom. Still on with Cheedy, he said. Commander, this kid is, the things he's done with this grid, you would not believe. Can we tie the March's weapons array into the station's defense grid? A pause. One the kind of pause that meant he was already running the calculation, already measuring the distances between possible and absolutely insane to see if they overlapped enough to be useful. The power coupling would be a problem, he said. The systems don't speak to each other natively. But if Chidi can modify the station-side emitter protocols and I modify the output modulation on our side... He stopped. Yeah, I think we can make them talk. It'll look weird and it won't be efficient, but it'll work. It'll extend the effective range of the station grid by a meaningful amount and let us add our fire to theirs. How long? If Chidi and I work in parallel, 3 hours. 3 hours to build something that had never been built. 3 hours with 47 Keth ships outside and a command vessel somewhere in the dark getting closer. Do it, Dara said. She turned to Priya. I need to talk to you about the navigational approach corridors. Priya had been waiting for this. She pulled up her own display, which she had already populated with every piece of navigational data they had on the Recavar system, because Priya didn't wait to be asked before doing the things that obviously needed to be done. The Keth have locked down the 3 primary approach vectors, but there's a gravitational anomaly at the edge of the system. A small brown dwarf, very dim. The Vailhari charts note it, but don't flag it as navigationally significant. If you go near it, you have to fight the gravity gradient, which is why everyone avoids it. She paused. I don't avoid gravity gradients. I know you don't. If I take us through the gradient and come around the far side of the station, we're approaching from a vector the Keth formation doesn't cover. They don't cover it because it's considered navigationally inadvisable. What happens to the ship? The march shakes a lot, and everything that isn't bolted down becomes a projectile, and Tomas yells at me in Portuguese, but the hull holds. She looked up. Probably. The hull is old, but it's actually very well built. The Vailhari build things to last even when they're building the things they don't care about, which I've always found very characteristic of them. A pause. I've run the route 4 times in simulation. It works every time. And coming out on the far side, we'd be inside their formation. Inside it, yes, right up against the station's undamaged docking side. She let that sit. Which means we could begin emergency evacuation of the non-combatants. There it was, the thing Dara had been circling. Because the math, the real math, the full math, said this. The March couldn't fight 47 ships, couldn't hold a perimeter, couldn't do any of the things a combat vessel would do in this situation. But it was a support carrier, which meant it had enormous internal capacity. It was built to move supplies and personnel. It was built for exactly the thing they needed it to do right now. And the Vailhari had given it to her because they thought it was useless. And the most exquisite part of the whole situation was that they had been completely correct about what it was built for and completely wrong about how that would matter. Start the evacuation route calculation, Dara said. Already done. Of course it is. She turned back to the tactical display. Jinho. Commander. I want to know everything about Keth sensor coverage. Specifically, what are they watching and what are they not watching, because they think nothing is going to come from there. He smiled in the small, careful way he smiled when a problem was offering him something to work with. Give me 20 minutes. 20 minutes. 3 hours to link the weapons arrays. 1 gravity gradient approach. 400 non-combatants to move. 31 hours until backup. And somewhere in the dark, a Keth command vessel making its way to Recavar to be present at the taking. The race had a clock on it now. Dara could feel it the way you feel weather changing. Not a sound, not a sight, something in the pressure of the air. Thus she sat down in her command chair, which was slightly too large for her because it had been built to Vailhari ergonomic specifications, and which she had therefore padded with 3 folded emergency blankets on the left side and a piece of foam insulation on the right because the March had never been given proper human fit fittings. And because she had decided, about 4 months into this assignment, that dignity required adaptation rather than suffering. She pulled up the tactical display on her personal screen. She started working. On the other side of the bridge, Ensign Threth watched her for a long moment. He had the expression of someone watching an equation that didn't match any model he'd been given, and he was trying to figure out if the equation was wrong or if the model was. He turned back to his console. He started helping. The Keth noticed them 53 minutes after the March arrived. Not because of anything the March did, because the Keth were methodical, and every 53 minutes they ran a full system scan as standard protocol. And on the 53rd minute scan, a single support carrier that had been sitting at the system's jump point registered on their sensors, and whoever ran that scan looked at it and presumably said, in whatever the Keth equivalent of "huh" was, something that meant the same thing. The response was not immediate. That was the first thing that surprised Jin Ho, who had been watching the Keth formation with the focused intensity of someone waiting for a dog to bite and trying to predict from which direction. The 47 ships didn't lunge. They shifted, a subtle rearrangement that wasn't an attack posture exactly, or more like the way a large animal turns its head to look at something. It's decided is probably not a threat, but wants to categorize. They think we're a courier, Jin Ho said. A what? A support carrier showing up at a siege. From their experience, that means we're delivering something. Medical supplies maybe, or a negotiating envoy. They don't... He worked through it. They don't process it as combat relevant. We're not flagging their threat response. Dara thought about that. She thought about the Vailhari Intelligence Division and their report. Human vessels are structurally adequate. Human navigators demonstrate competence within established parameters. She thought about the way you catalogued something when you thought you already understood it. The way you stopped seeing it clearly the moment you'd filed it in the right drawer. And the Keth had filed the march in the right drawer. Support carrier, non-combatant, low priority. Rada, she said quietly, do not respond to any Keth hails. Rada blinked. Standard protocol is to identify, I know what standard protocol is, don't respond. Let them look at their drawer. Let them keep seeing what they expected to see. She had 2 hours and 40 minutes left before Tomas and Chidi finished linking the weapons arrays. She had Priya's approach route mapped and ready. She had Jinho's sensor gap analysis open on her screen, a navigational blind spot on the station's far side where the Keth formation had a gap just wide enough, if you were willing to go through the gravity gradient, to thread a ship through. She had 83 people who were, collectively, the most motivated workforce she had ever commanded. Because they'd been told their whole careers they were support roles only, and they had 11 days of siege and 1,600 lives and 31 hours of waiting for someone more important stacked in their chest like kindling, and she had just handed them a match. Tomas was running the weapons array integration on 4 hours of sleep and his third cup of coffee, talking in a constant low undertone to Chidi on the station's end. A bilateral conversation that seemed to have evolved its own private language somewhere around hour 2. Half engineering notation, half something that sounded like the two of them had become friends during a crisis. Which was probably the most human thing that had happened in this situation and possibly the most tactically important. You needed someone on the other end who would tell you when a coupling was heating wrong before it became a problem, and you needed to trust them enough to believe it. And that trust had to come from somewhere, and apparently it could come from 11 days of siege and 1 support carrier, and a shared belief that we are not done yet. Sable had taken over a corridor on Deck 3 and converted it into a staging area for medical triage. She had her team of 6 doing inventory, not of what they had, which she already knew, but of what they were likely to need, which required her to make a series of assumptions about the next 31 hours that she had written down on a notepad in her small, precise handwriting and not shared with anyone, because some math was for keeping to yourself until it became either wrong or necessary. Rook, Sparrow, and 8 had been assigned to the loading bays. They were Polari, which meant they were short and broad and covered in the thin-scaled skin that the Polari had evolved for the high UV environment of their home system, and they had the most extraordinary spatial memory of anyone on the ship. They could navigate a fully loaded cargo bay in complete darkness and tell you the weight distribution of every container by memory. Dara had assigned them to begin configuring the loading bays for emergency personnel transport, which meant pulling out the cargo racking and reconfiguring the space for human-scale use. And they had been at it for 90 minutes, and from what she could tell, they were doing it the way they did everything, which was in almost complete silence, and in a state of perfect focused competence that Dara found more reassuring than most of the noise she was surrounded by. Ensign Threth had started doing something she hadn't asked him to do. She noticed it peripherally. He was at the secondary communications board, running what looked like a background process, something low power and persistent. Not flagged to her attention. Not disruptive. She watched him for a few minutes without seeming to watch him, and eventually she understood what she was seeing. He was monitoring Keth communications frequencies, not intercepting. The encryption made that impossible for a ship with their hardware. But the signal patterns, the traffic rhythms, the way a fleet's communication traffic changes when something is coming toward it, with the way the volume and cadence of internal comms shifts when command-level traffic is incoming from somewhere else. He was listening for the command vessel. He hadn't told her he was doing this. He had just started doing it because he had identified the thing that mattered and he had the skills to work on it, and he had started working. She looked away from him and back at the tactical display. Potential without proof, the Veilhari taxonomy said. She filed that under pending. At 2 hours and 12 minutes, Tomas came over the intercom and said, in the tone he used when something had worked that had no business working, "Commander, we have a weapons integration. It is ugly, and I will never show it to another engineer, and I am unreasonably proud of it." "Does it work?" "Chidi just ran a power test. It works." A pause. "And Chidi says to tell you, and I'm quoting, 'Tell her I said she better be worth it.' Tell him I said I know. He'll love that." She closed the channel and looked at the clock. 2 hours and 12 minutes. The battle group was still 29 hours out. The command vessel, she looked at Threth, who was still listening to the signal traffic patterns, was still an unknown quantity. The gravity gradient approach route was ready. The evacuation configuration in the loading bays was 60% complete. It was time. "All hands," she said, over ship-wide. "This is the commander. In approximately 40 minutes, we are going to do something that is navigationally interesting and tactically unprecedented and, depending on your perspective, either brilliantly unconventional or completely insane. I have been assured by Lieutenant Nair that the hull will hold. I believe her. I need everyone at their stations secured with loose objects stowed. This is not a drill, and I won't pretend it is. What I will tell you is this. There are 1,600 people on that station. We are the only ship within 30 hours that can reach them. So we're going to reach them." She paused. Vasquez out. Priya was already at the navigation console. She had the approach plotted in 3 parallel tracks. Primary, contingency, contingency, contingency. Because that was how Priya operated, not from anxiety, but from the specific discipline of someone who believed that preparation wasn't pessimism. It was respect for complexity. She was wearing the expression she wore when she was about to do something she'd simulated 4 times and was now doing for real, which was calm in the specific way of someone who had already spent all their nervousness in the simulation runs and now had nothing left but the work. "Ready when you are, Commander." Dara took one last look at the tactical display. 47 ships in formation, holding, waiting for their matriarch. "Take us through." The unbroken march moved. Priya took them wide, first, out and away from the jump point, a heading that looked like a courier's adjustment, nothing threatening, nothing tactical, just the natural drift of a support vessel repositioning. The Keth traffic shifted, faintly, on Threth's monitor. They were updating their tracking data, still categorizing. Then she cut the approach angle hard. The brown dwarf came up fast on the forward viewport, not visible exactly, but present. The way gravity is present, felt in the way the ship's automated systems started compensating and compensating and compensating for a gradient that the navigation computer had been designed to avoid. Warning indicators lit up across 3 consoles. Not alarms, the ship wasn't in distress. The systems were doing what they were designed to do, and what they were designed to do was avoid this exact gravitational situation, and so they were shouting about it in the ways systems shouted, through displays and alerts, and a low vibration that started in the deck plates and worked its way up through the furniture and the chairs, and into the human bodies sitting in them. "Threth," said Dara, "you should hold on to something." He grabbed the edge of his console with both hands. He said nothing. His knuckles, which were a slightly different shade than the rest of his Vilehari skin, went different still. The march went into the gradient. Later, Dara would try to explain what it felt like, and would fail, because there wasn't a metaphor for it that was also honest. The closest she got was, imagine that gravity is a river, and you have gone into the current sideways, and the current is trying to turn you, and you are trying not to be turned, and the ship is the boat, and Priya is the oar, and the oar is very good. The deck plates sang. The hull talked to itself in a language of stress and flex. For 3 containers in the loading bay that Rook had not yet secured broke free and became the projectiles Priya had predicted and landed with sounds that Tomas logged and would later describe as character. Priya flew. Dara had seen people fly spacecraft before, had done it herself, was rated for emergency piloting of vessels up to Class 4, had logged more hours in training simulators than she liked to think about. What Priya did was not flying a spacecraft. It was more like the spacecraft was an extension of her body that she had had for so long she didn't think about it in terms of controls anymore, only in terms of intention. She wanted the march to thread a gap 2 degrees wide between a gravity gradient and a Keth interdiction line, and the march went there. The vibration peaked. Someone on the bridge, she thought it was Jin Ho, which surprised her, made a sound that was 90% involuntary and 10% profanity. And then they were through. Recavar station filled the forward viewport. Close, so close Dara could see the damage from this angle, the scoring on the station's outer hull where the Keth assault had hit, the dark sections where power had been lost, the flickering of the defense grid's surviving emitters running their cycles. The station was wounded. It was still standing. The 2 things occupied the same space in Dara's chest in a way that pressed. And they were on the far side, inside the formation. In the gap, the Keth hadn't covered because covering it required flying through something inadvisable. Rada, hail the station. Already on with Chidi, he says... She stopped. She was listening. Why, he says the weapons array integration is active on their end. He's reading our targeting data. A pause. He says, and I quote, "Holy Mother of God, it actually worked." Dara said, "Tell him it's not over." He says he knows. He says he's been saying that to himself for 11 days. She looked at the tactical display. The Keth formation was reacting now. The 53-minute scan cycle had updated, and the 47 ships had registered that the support carrier they'd categorized as a courier had moved from the jump point to a position that made no tactical sense, unless the tactical sense was something they hadn't modeled. Which it was. "Lena," she said. Weapons Officer Lena Marsh had been sitting at her station for 2 hours in the particular focused stillness of someone who had prepared everything she could prepare and was now waiting for the moment the preparation became relevant. She was the one on the ship Dara worried about the least, which was backward from what you'd expect. Lena was the weapons officer, she was the point of the spear. Shouldn't the worry concentrate there? But Lena had the specific piece of someone who had found the thing they were very good at and settled into it entirely. And that piece was, paradoxically, the most reassuring thing on the bridge. "Ready," Lena said. "Combined fire with the station grid. I want them to feel it, not be destroyed by it. Not yet. I want them to feel it and recalculate." Lena's fingers moved. The unbroken march. The old support carrier with the embarrassing name, the ship the Vilehari had assigned because they'd figured it was the most they owed the human contingent, and the least that mattered, opened fire on a Keth siege fleet. Not alone. The station grid came alive alongside it. Chidi's jury-rigged creativity and profanity defense grid, linked by Tomas and Chidi's 3 hours of ugly, brilliant engineering into something that was technically a unified weapons platform, fired. The combined strike hit the nearest Keth destroyer on its exposed flank, the flank that faced the gap they'd just come through, the flank the destroyer hadn't thought needed covering. It wasn't enough to destroy it. It wasn't meant to. The Keth destroyer took the hit and its hull absorbed it, and its automated defenses screamed, and its crew scrambled, and it moved, turned toward the new threat. And in turning, it opened a gap in the interdiction line on the station's docking side. A gap exactly large enough for a support carrier to begin emergency evacuation. "Rada," Dara said. "Get me Station Master Voss." The channel opened. "Commander Vasquez," said Voss, and his voice had changed. Not from shock, she realized, but from something that was the opposite of shock. Something that was the recognition of a person who had been calculating their survival odds for 11 days and had just watched one of the variables change. "I see you. Station Master, I need you to begin moving your non-combatants to the emergency docking corridor. The gap we've opened will not stay open long. We can take approximately 400 people in the loading bays, more if we stack them, which I'm told is not ideal but is better than the alternative. Moving them now." A pause. "Commander, the Keth. They're going to react." "Yes." "You know that." "Yes." The longest pause. "What are you going to do?" Dara looked at the tactical display. The Keth formation was moving now. Not the full rearrangement that would close the gap before the evacuation could begin. Not yet, but the early shifts of a fleet recalculating its position on something that had just changed category from courier, non-combatant, to something they didn't have a clear label for. She thought about that. About the power of not having a clear label. "I'm going to keep them busy figuring out what we are," she said. She closed the channel. "Priya," she said, "I need you to be somewhere the Keth don't expect every 6 minutes." Priya looked at her across the bridge. "Every 6 minutes," she repeated. "Whatever you need to do, wherever they don't expect us to be. I want them spending their processing power on our position instead of on closing that gap." Priya turned back to her console. The march moved again. Behind them, through the docking corridor on the station's far side, the first evacuation transport pod launched. Then the second. Outside, 47 Keth ships tried to figure out what kind of thing they were dealing with. They had no model for it. That was, Dara had come to understand, the only weapon she'd ever had. The Keth command vessel arrived at hour 19. They knew it before they saw it because Threth, who had not left his communications station in 14 hours, who had drunk 2 cups of the Vilhari equivalent of tea and eaten something that 8 had brought him without being asked, and who had been listening to signal traffic patterns in the focused, patient way his people listened to things when they had decided that listening was what was required, said, "Commander, the traffic pattern has changed." Dara was at the tactical display. She'd been at the tactical display for most of the last 14 hours. Also with breaks for 2 cups of coffee and 1 20-minute sleep that Sable had practically ordered her to take by standing in the doorway of the observation deck and radiating medical authority until Dara lay down on the bench and closed her eyes and woke up not feeling better exactly, but feeling like a person who had slept 20 minutes instead of a person who had not. She looked at Threth. He had a signal analysis on his screen. Not the raw communication data, but the meta patterns, the rhythm of traffic. The way a fleet communicates differently when it's receiving orders from a command-level vessel versus operating on its distributed protocols. She could see it even from across the bridge, the shift in frequency, the increased volume. How long? Based on the signal distance at the last intercept, maybe 40 minutes, maybe less. 28 minutes to the battle group, 40 minutes to the command vessel. The math had changed. She took a breath and did not let the number land anywhere it would be visible. 14 hours ago, she had 400 non-combatants to evacuate before the command vessel arrived. 400 had sounded possible. 400 had sounded like the kind of problem you could solve if everyone did their job, and the hull held. And Priya was where the Keth didn't expect her every 6 minutes. They'd moved 263. The gap in the Keith interdiction line was holding, barely. And only because every time it started to close, Lena and Chidi fired into it together and held it open, and every time they fired, the Keth recalculated, and every time the Keth recalculated, and Priya moved the march to where they weren't expecting it, and every 6 minutes, the Keth tried to pin them down, and every 6 minutes they couldn't, and the gap stayed open for the evacuation pods to keep moving. And this had been working. For 14 hours, it had been working. The command vessel changed the arithmetic. A Keth fleet operating on distributed protocols was a fleet that made decisions by committee. Slow, weighted, careful not to damage a station they intended to claim. A Keth fleet with a command matriarch present was a fleet with a single will, and single wills moved faster. They would close the gap. They would accept station damage to end the irritant. The calculus would shift. "Priya," Dara said. "I heard." Priya was already at her console, not with any visible urgency. Priya didn't do visible urgency. It used up processing power she preferred to spend elsewhere. But with the complete focused attention of someone whose entire consciousness had narrowed to one problem. "I can keep them off balance longer if I use the gradient. Come back through it, use it as cover. And the hull? Third pass will be harder. The metal's been through a lot." A pause. "Probably fine. Probably fine." Dara noted that this was a downgrade from the probably that it applied to the first pass, but she also noted that Priya was the person saying it, and Priya had run the simulations. "Do it." She turned to the intercom. "Tomas?" "Yeah?" "What's the situation on the evacuation bays?" "We've got 263 in. The loading bays are at capacity. We've got people in the corridors, the mess hall, 2 of the equipment storage rooms, and I'm pretty sure there are families in my engineering bay, which is a violation of about 12 safety protocols, but the kids seem interested in the conduit junctions, so I'm calling it educational." A pause, shorter and without the comedy in it. "Commander, the last group is about 90 people, mostly station crew, non-mobile medical patients and the wounded from the last Keth assault. They're moving slow. 90 people, 40 minutes. 90 people who moved slowly and 40 minutes before the fleet stopped being a committee." She ran the math. Not the math that said abort. The other math. "Sable," she said. Medical Officer Wren's voice came over the intercom with the quality it had taken on about 6 hours ago, which was the quality of someone who had been doing the work that needed to be done and had filed all the feelings about it somewhere to be retrieved later when there was time. "Commander, I need to know which of the medical patients on the station can be moved faster if we send people over." A pause. "You're thinking of sending crew? Volunteers? How many?" "As many as I can spare without compromising the ship's function. 6, maybe 8. A longer pause. "Give me 4 minutes. 4 minutes." She had 38. She turned to the bridge. She looked at her people. Jin Ho at tactical, running intercept projections he updated every 2 minutes. Rada on communications, managing 3 simultaneous channels between the ship, the station, and the automated distress beacon she'd been sending toward the battle group since hour 1. So Threth at the secondary board, listening to the shape of Keth traffic with the patience of someone who had realized somewhere in the last 14 hours that what he'd understood about humans required a significant revision. "I need volunteers," she said, "to go across to the station and help move patients." She had expected a moment of hesitation. The request had risk in it. Going across to the station meant being on the station when the command vessel arrived, and the command vessel arriving meant the gap closing, and the gap closing meant... She had expected a moment. She did not get one. Jin Ho said, "I'll go." Rook, from the intercom in the loading bay, said, "Us too." 4 others said yes before she'd finished understanding that no one was going to say no. 8 of you, she said. "Move. Irada will route you through the docking corridor." She watched them go. Threth was watching her. She didn't look at him. She looked at the tactical display. The command vessel's approach vector was starting to register now on the edge of their long-range sensor sweep, a contact that was larger than the destroyers, larger than anything currently in the formation, large in the way that things are large when they mean something. "Commander," Threth said. "Ensign." "The Vailhari tactical model," he said carefully, in the manner of someone disassembling a thing they have held for a long time, "does not contain a category for this." A pause. "For an unwinnable tactical situation being reframed as a resource problem." She looked at him then. He held her gaze in the Veilhari way, which was direct and somewhat unblinking, and meant something different in their culture than staring did in hers. It meant, I am attending to you. I am not looking past you. What you are is what I am looking at. It was never unwinnable, she said. It was just unsupported. He considered that. She watched him consider it with the specific attention she'd learned in 6 months of working alongside Veilhari officers, the slight pause before response that meant something was being genuinely processed rather than reflexively filtered. The distinction seems important to humans. It's everything. The command vessel resolved on the long-range display. It was enormous. It had the organic Keth architecture of the other ships, grown rather than built, asymmetrical, and beautiful in its specific way, but scaled up by a factor that communicated hierarchy without anything so crude as a flag or a marking. It was the kind of vessel that announced itself by existing. It was also, according to Threth's traffic analysis, 22 minutes out. Jinho's team, Rada said from communications, is across. Station confirms. Dara looked at the clock. 22 minutes. 90 people minus however many Jinho and the others could move. The march shook as Priya took it into the gradient's edge for the 3rd time, not fully through, using it as cover the way a smaller animal uses the density of a forest. Not hiding exactly, more like making yourself difficult to track by staying where the tracking is hard. The hull sang its stressed language again, and this time there were harmonics in it that hadn't been there before, and Dara noted them and said nothing. Lena fired. The gap held. The evacuation pods kept moving. 14 minutes. 71 people. Dara stood at the command console and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who cannot process the abort variable. She had read that report so many times. She had read it as an insult, as a dismissal, as the Veilhari filing humanity in the right drawer and closing it. She had read it as something to be overcome. She looked at it differently now. The abort variable exists because some things are not worth the cost. The abort variable is rational. It is correct, much of the time. The Veilhari had 11,000 years of data to support it, and they were not wrong. But there is a thing that humans carry that does not live inside the rational model, and it is not stupidity, and it is not an error, and it is not a computational failure. It is the knowledge, cellular, ancient, pre-language, that the cost of leaving someone is paid forever. That you can optimize your survival and spend the rest of your existence knowing the shape of what you left behind. That the calculation the abort variable runs does not include that cost because it cannot quantify it. Humans quantified it. That was the thing the intelligence division had filed under behavioral irregularity and missed. 8 minutes. 54 people. Commander. Rada's voice. Jinho is asking for 2 more minutes. Tell him he has them. The command vessel. Tell him he has them, Rada. 6 minutes. 31 people. The command vessel hit the outer edge of the formation and the Keth fleet changed. Threth's traffic display lit up. Not with alarm exactly, but with the specific pattern of a distributed system receiving a unified signal, finding its hierarchy, consolidating. The 47 ships stopped being 47 decisions and became one decision. The gap began to close. Jinho, Dara said, over the intercom. His voice came back, and she could hear behind it the sounds of a station corridor. Footsteps, voices, the low hum of systems under strain. 23 more. We're moving them. Jinho, the gap is closing. I know. A beat. 23 more, Commander. She looked at the tactical display. She looked at the gap. She looked at Priya, who was looking at her. Open the gap again, she said to Lena. Lena opened it. The unbroken march fired everything it had. Everything, the combined array, every emitter in the station's linked grid, the entire ugly, brilliant, cobbled-together thing that Tomas and Chidi had built in 3 hours and run for 14. Into the formation's flank. The Keth command vessel's response was immediate and overwhelming, and for approximately 90 seconds, the March was taking fire from 3 separate Keth destroyers, and the hull was not singing anymore. It was screaming. And Tomas was saying things that Dara was pretty sure weren't Portuguese. They were beyond Portuguese. They were some new language he was inventing in real time from the parts of every language he'd ever known that were suitable for this specific moment. And Jinho's voice came over the intercom. "We're through, all 23. We're through, Commander. Now close the corridor." She closed the corridor. The March lurched as Priya threw it sideways into the gradient's edge, using the gravity to absorb momentum from the Keth fire the way a martial artist uses force, redirecting rather than resisting, and the hull screamed one final sustained note and then went quiet. Not the quiet of failure, the quiet of a thing that had held 346 non-combatants. 22 minutes until the battle group. The Keth command vessel was fully present now, enormous and organic and the center of gravity of the fleet, and Dara looked at it on the tactical display and felt the weight of 47 ships and one unified will arrayed against one old support carrier and a wounded station and 83 human crew members and 4 alien enlisted personnel who had given themselves nicknames. And she thought, we made them wait. That was the thing. In the calculus of siege warfare, the Keth had arrived at Recavar station with a specific timeline. They had prosecuted the siege according to that timeline. They had waited for their matriarch because the matriarch would preside over the taking. And in the 19 hours since the unbroken march had dropped out of jump at the edge of the system, the Keth had been doing something they did not have a model for, waiting for a support carrier to explain itself. They had been inside the Keth's decision-making loop the whole time. Not because they were stronger, not because they were better armed or better positioned or had better tactical models. Because they had done something irrational, arrived without sufficient force, engaged without sufficient capability. It refused to stop without sufficient reason. And the Keth had spent 19 hours trying to categorize an entity that did not fit any of their categories. And in those 19 hours, 346 people had moved from a dying station to a living ship. The battle group dropped out of jump at hour 22, 3 hours ahead of their projected arrival, because Admiral Vayan had pushed her fleet at 115% of recommended drive capacity after receiving the March's distress beacon, which she would later describe in the official report as an operationally justified risk, and in private conversation as, "I have never in 11,000 years of Vailhari history received a distress beacon from a support carrier that was actively engaged with a siege fleet, and I wasn't going to miss whatever was happening." What was happening when the battle group arrived was this. The Unbroken March was sitting between the Keth command vessel and Recavar station. Not because it had fought the fleet to a standstill, not because it had won anything in the conventional sense, but because it was there, in a position that made no tactical sense and every human sense, and the Keth formation. 19 hours of watching something that didn't fit their models had paused. You did not pause a Keth fleet. The Keth did not pause. They had paused. In the investigation that would follow, the Vailhari analysts would study the tactical logs for a long time. They would produce a report that was longer and considerably more uncertain than the one they had produced before. The original report had a clear conclusion. The new report had a different kind of ending, a sentence that the lead analyst would describe as the most difficult sentence I have written in my career, because it requires me to revise a taxonomy I have held for 40 years. The sentence was, "The behavioral anomaly previously classified as an inability to process the abort variable appears, on analysis, to be a distinct strategic capability for which current models have no designation." Dara read that report in the observation deck of the Unbroken March 6 days after Recavar, with a hot cup of coffee this time. The stars outside the viewport were back to their normal distance, their normal sharpness, the familiar cold light of space being space. Threth knocked on the open doorframe. She looked up. He stood in the entrance for a moment with the particular Vailhari posture of someone who has something to say that they have composed carefully before saying it, because Vailhari took language seriously and did not casually offer words they had not weighed. He was young. She kept coming back to that, kept seeing it in him, this young officer who had drawn the short straw of the integration program and spent 6 months cataloguing human behavioral irregularities and had arrived at Recavar still working from the model he'd been given and had spent 19 hours watching the model fail. "Commander," he said, "may I have filed an amendment to my personal observational record?" She waited. "The phrase Vithala Muir," he said carefully. "Species in the process of almost becoming something." He paused. "I no longer believe it applies." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 11,000 years of data. She thought about 412 catalogued species. She thought about a civilization so old it had the luxury of precision, of taxonomy, of the clean filing system of accumulated knowledge, and how that precision was its own kind of blindness. The blindness of the expert who has seen so much that they have stopped being surprised, who has filed everything and keeps finding the new things in the old drawers. She thought about 90 human crew members and 4 alien enlisted personnel who had named themselves Rook and Sparrow and 8, and an ensign on a dying station who had kept a defense grid alive on creativity and profanity for 11 days, and a navigator who treated gravity gradients as a navigational suggestion, and a weapons officer who found peace in the point of the spear, and a chief engineer who made the impossible talk to each other and was unreasonably proud of it. She thought about 346 people who were alive. "Thank you, Ensign," she said. He nodded, the small formal Vailhari nod. And then he did something that surprised her. He stayed. He stood in the doorframe and looked at the stars with her, not speaking. In the comfortable quiet of a person who had decided to keep watching something rather than filing it away. She turned back to the viewport. The stars were sharp. Too close. Just like that. She drank her coffee. It was, for once, hot.